really briefly touch on some of the patient level factors. And one of the interventions that we had a great success with a few years ago at Hospital Center at the Cancer Institute, focusing mainly on the patient level barriers and touching on things that are very real and justifiable reasons for the resistance and hesitancy to participate in clinical trials, especially therapeutic or treatment clinical trials. And so we focused on a method of communication that was based on narrative communication and storytelling in this clinical trial specifically for Black patients and specifically for patients who had an active cancer diagnosis. And what we aimed to do was to first develop a patient education video as a means of intervention, touching on the very specific attitudes that we know are salient within this patient population within this community, and then actually doing a brief intervention trial to ensure, to test to see if this intervention would work. And for this, the communication methods that we use, we knew from different studies that have been done that this communication method works very well to reach the population of interest. And so again, the focus on the initial trial was looking at the race-based disparities that we see in breast cancer. Absolutely true and very glaring in Washington, D.C., but similar across the nation. And so looking at, so on the chart on the right, the pink line you will see is white patients, and on the black line is Black patients. And so you'll see in terms of incidence, in terms of who's getting cancer at higher rates, you'll see the pink line is above the black line, meaning there's a higher incidence among whites, a lower incidence among Blacks. However, the mortality is a flipped pattern and very concerning though. So even though Black women tend to get breast cancer at a lower rate than their white counterparts, they are much more likely to die from it and to get more severe disease. And so the consequences, there's a major gap leading to a lack of clinical trial findings. And when you recognize that Black women are also not as likely to be on the clinical trials, and you see these mortality patterns, it's a really, really concerning outcome. And so important in breast cancer care where these racial and ethnic disparities exist, but then we also expanded this to other cancers where we see the same patterns. And so that was our initial target population. And what we did was focus on 6 main attitudinal barriers. So these were known cultural attitudinal factors that came up in the literature over and over and over. So when studies have been done and different groups and researchers talked to people, a lot of the concerns centered around these 6 things. The first was, and I will note that a lot of these things haven't changed, just even in the conversation that we're having today and the conversation that Chioma will continue on, is basic fear and distrust of the medical establishment across the board, and sort of this white coat issue, rooted firmly in historical abuses that people are aware of and those that people aren't aware of, just sort of storytelling has also contributed to this. The second was a concern about the ethical conduct of researchers. So this idea that I don't want to be a guinea pig, and Dr. Richardson mentioned it, I really am not going to do it, because to a lot of people, they equate clinical trial with guinea pig and testing, when that's in fact not the case. The third was the fear of loss of the type of quality of health that they would receive, that if they signed a research consent form, they either would not get as good care or high quality care, because now they're just a research subject or research participant. And then related to that, worry that they would be treated that they would treat poor or minority patients unfairly, so that study teams would not have equal treatment for patients from minoritized groups. And then one really key one, and again, still the same, a fear of loss of privacy, that somehow signing that consent form, you're signing away your rights, and you've also given the study team the rights to find out everything about you, was a big deterrent. And then finally, which really came out as a key one, was just a general lack of knowledge and awareness of clinical trials. So what a clinical trial was, what it actually meant, what did it mean in terms of the active treatment that patients were receiving, et cetera. So there was just this general lack of knowledge that this is actually a treatment option in a lot of cases for our patients. So the next slide, the key features when we were developing the intervention was we really wanted, and it was important to have community representation. And so central to the development was a community advisory group who were a key part of us developing the actual content for the video. And these were representatives from different DC nonprofit organizations. We had some government people, we had some actual just community residents, and then folks from faith-based organizations, and various consumer and patient advocates. So we were making sure we were hitting all the perspectives, and they approved the scripts, they approved, sort of everything about the video development. And then we worked with a professional video storyteller because it was really important to have something that was quality and not something that looks like I made it. And so, we wrote that in the budget as an important part. And we worked with a national recognized narrator, and this was a key piece because for these types of communication campaigns, and I think Shoma will also speak to this, the importance of having sort of this local celebrity who is oftentimes more trusted than a physician or a doctor or some other person. And so this ended up being key because it really grabbed everyone's attention when they started. And this was actually ABC's Andrea Roan who worked with us on this. And then the really critical central piece was the core content was from real patients, their real stories, unscripted. And, we had we asked them general questions, but everything was filmed just as the words are from their mouth. And that really came across. And this idea of narrative-based storytelling was really the hook for our intervention. And so briefly to tell you who was included in the key in the first initial pilot of it on the next slide. So we were primarily targeting just breast cancer patients who self-identified as Black or African American. It was important for us that they identified rather than we put them in this group or category. They were recently diagnosed with anything other than stage 4 cancer, and that they were anticipating having treatment at one of the participating MedStar hospitals, and over 18, of course. And that one piece was important, that they be eligible for a trial, because there are, of course, ethical issues around having this sort of discussion if the patients weren't even eligible for a trial in the first place. And so what we did was create an actual validated instrument. Another piece of this work that we recognized is a lot of the validated instruments that exist don't actually apply for this population because they're not validated in that population and they're not representative. So on the next slide, I just have a really brief snapshot that I'm not going to go over, but you can take a look at with the types of questions that we asked on our instrument. And we had the patients take the survey before we presented and then had them take it again at various intervals after. But you'll see the questions line up with each of those 6 barriers that we identified. And then on the next slide, just a quick summary of the findings. So for the second part of the trial, where it was expanded out beyond our initial pilot, after showing the patients the video, doing a before and after survey, of the 200 patients who participated in this, almost 20% of the patients actually signed a consent to participate in a therapeutic clinical trial. And almost 14% actually went on to enroll, resulting in an increase over and above the baseline clinical trial participation at these institutions of almost 8%, which is highly, highly significant. And so, sort of thinking about it in terms of what it takes to actually persuade or change. I don't like to use the word persuade because obviously, we want it to be the patient's own choice, but really change the way they think about clinical trials. We had a really significant impact. And then 72% of patients actually signed a consent enrolled within 6 months of the larger intervention, which we thought was really important and obviously significant. And then the last piece I want to highlight from this trial, and there's a lot of the details that I didn't go into, but on the next slide, it was really important to see how long after the initial communication, the effects, if you will, lasted. And so you'll see that pre-video, there was, if you looked at the proportion who expressed likelihood to enroll in the trial, about 52% expressed likelihood. And remember, this doesn't actually mean they went on to enroll. It was just sort of their intention to. But then this bumped up to 65% immediately after they watched the video, and that was statistically significant. But even more telling was in the follow-up, which was for some patients up to a month later, and we still maintained that effect, and that was statistically significant as well. And so overall, the conclusions and our learnings from this, what they suggest on the next slide. So essentially, we showed and demonstrated both in the initial pilot and the larger study, the effectiveness of communicating via a culturally tailored video and to successfully improve clinical trial participation among this group of cancer patients. And the overwhelming takeaway is that the intervention doesn't have to be that complex, and something as straightforward as a video intervention can actually be really impactful, and most importantly, rapidly and widely disseminated. And we actually still to this day get lots of requests from different pharma companies, from different study teams to use the video. And so to close it out, on the last slide, just reiterating the importance, given everything that we've seen and the relative ease of changing the narrative, of having different conversations around these, around clinical trials, the importance of increasing racial and ethnic diversity in our clinical trials. And it remains a challenge, but we've given an example of how it can be addressed. And really the issue being that the advancement of cancer care and the care of other conditions as well, where we see disparities, is really delayed if we don't come up with effective interventions. And the really key part that our trial and others have showed, and I think the current conversation around vaccines is showing, is that it's really critical that we recognize what cultural barriers are being faced by our different racial, ethnic, and other minoritized groups, and really creating our communication so that we are addressing those effectively.